Welcome, everyone. Let me do the honors of doing the introduction. I'm taking this from the UNESCO website. Dorothy Gordon is the chair of the UNESCO Information for All programs and board member of the UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies and Education. She has worked in the field of international development and technology for over 30 years and is recognized as a leading technology activist and a specialist on policy, education, technology, and society in Africa. Her work as a leader, manager, consultant, and speaker has taken her to over 100 countries. She is a strong advocate of the Rome Principles, Internet Universality, building on her work with the Open Movement and Creative Commons. Leveraging her government, corporate, civil society, and UN policy and management experience, she currently works as an advisor and management consultant. Previously, as the founding director general of the Ghana India Kofi Annan Center of Excellence in ICT, she strategically positioned the center as a leading technology and training and consulting partnership on the African continent. During her tenure, she actively encouraged greater participation of women in STEM, supported Ghana's startup economy, and built global tech partnerships to complement South-South cooperation with India. She served as a senior manager with UNDP in India and held other management and specialist positions in Geneva, New York, and Zambia. She mentors volunteers, serves on governing boards, and award juries with a number of local and global initiatives working to define a better technology-mediated future. These include Creative Commons, IEEE Working Group ICLEI, Castle Cove Foundation, Literary Bridge Ghana, UNESCO, and the World Summit Awards. She holds degrees from the University of Ghana and the University of Sussex Institute of Development Studies, where she trained as a development economist. She works in both English and French. Welcome, Dorothy. It's a pleasure to have you here. And we'll turn over to the next slide.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Alfredo. I see that we don't have many students here yet, but I hope that we will still have some good questions and that those of you who will watch this later will enjoy the session and the Socratic approach that I'm taking to this subject of social and cultural dimensions. So let's go to the next slide. And I want you to think about power, and I want you to think about equality. I would have had many more beautiful images in my slideshow, but I was afraid that that could create some data issues when some of you would be uploading. So how do we measure the impact of the internet on our societies and on our cultures? And I just want you to think about this, because in my view, we haven't got a good answer to this yet. And there are very few countries that are actually trying to understand how the impact is, how the internet is affecting their societies and what role it plays in transforming their culture. It's being done piecemeal, but not being done in a systematic way. So let's go to the next slide where we can see what we wanted to do. And if you look at the WSIS Declaration, the first article is very clear that we want to promote, we want people to achieve their full potential, promote their sustainable development, improve their quality of life. And that means that we are committed to building a people-centered, inclusive, and I say again, inclusive, development-oriented information society, where everyone can create, access, and utilize and share information and knowledge. So this is what we set out in 2003. And if you look at WSIS, they actually put together the idea of getting a fund that would help this to happen. But of course, looking back, we know that there wasn't that much money that went to that fund. And instead, we have a number of disparate initiatives where we haven't really been able to track impact. And it's continuing. We have, in 2015, UNESCO member states endorsed the Rome Principles that we want an internet that is more than infrastructure and applications. It's a network of economic and social interactions and relationships. And the concept is based on 4 principles: human rights-based, open, accessible, and a multi-stakeholder participation. So let's move on. And right now, we're still working on this. And I hope that you'll be able to reference the Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation. It has 8 goals, including digital inclusion for all, including the most vulnerable. And here I wish we had people online who could tell me in the chat who they think are the most vulnerable. Up to date, the people who haven't been online or who are more marginal when it comes to online life include women, people living with disability, older people, rural people, people on the wrong side of the income divide, and people on the wrong side of the language divide. Who are the most vulnerable? So that's a question that you should keep in mind. And now we have evolved to a global digital compact, which is, I think when you read it up, you'll see that it's truly trying to make it more multi-stakeholder. And then we have the World Economic Forum, which says that it's come up with the world's first network that is dedicated to inclusion, the Edison Alliance. And I think that it's very interesting to look at what they want to do and who gets invited to join them, who gets approved. And then we have UNESCO's Information for All program, which I chair at the moment. And building on WSIS, it also strives to build inclusive and equitable knowledge societies. So if we move on now, we've been working on it for some time. What are we really concerned about at the moment? And I want you to think about how the internet is impacting on your own lives and the lives of those people who are around you. And we see not very popular in the media, but we see concerns about linguistic and cultural diversity on the internet. And what are we talking about there? We're talking about the fact that there's a perception that most of the content online is in English and it originates from certain cultures, dominant cultures and societies. And that if you are in a small language group, let's say you are living in Latin America and you do not speak Spanish or Portuguese, it's your second language, how much content will you be able to find in your own language online? Then we have a whole set of issues linked with child safety online. And there are a number of agencies that have been working on this. How do we make sure that children are not exposed to certain types of content? And there have been a lot of arguments around this because some people believe, well, kids will just have to deal with it because they have to deal with all kinds of other things in life. Why should we be extra protective of them when they're online? But we've seen that it can have very serious implications. And I've given you the link here to the specific initiative by Baroness Kidron, which is now taking off in terms of a children's code, and that companies have to sign on that they will observe this. Then we have all the discussions about artificial intelligence. People are worried about jobs, but more and more, people are worried about things like algorithmic bias. And I think that most people would be aware of the softwares that are used in the criminal justice system in the US that actively sift you. Let's hope it's been corrected now, but I understand that some jurisdictions are still using these softwares in the original form, where just by checking the skin color, they would indicate that you have a higher propensity to commit crime. Or those softwares that look at CVs, and if you are the wrong ethnicity, you wouldn't be included in the list of potential applicants to take to the next stage of the interviewing process. And then we have all the issues around surveillance capitalism. I really enjoyed Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And what's really interesting for me is the fact that now, when it comes to elections around the world, there are a myriad of Cambridge Analytica clones which are active on, I mean, almost every political party that can afford it has hired them to have that influence on the electorate. So if we go to the next slide.
Dorothy, sorry to interrupt you before we move on to the next slide. You bring up great points on this slide with all these issues that impact those that are underserved regarding access to internet, and even as you well meant,
those who are well served.
Right. So my question is, and I'm not sure if you're going to touch on this, but how do you see the internet impacting the governments, geopolitically talking, to get more people connected to the internet?
Yes, we will get there. Don't
Okay,
worry.
thank you.
So I actually, let me be clear. What should we worry about? This slide is talking about the things that are on the minds of those people who are already online. Those people who are not online may not be aware of all of these issues. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And I also see that I missed out the issue of mental health. And we see that increasingly people are worried about the amount of time that people are spending on social media, for example, and how that is affecting their ability to cope. And lots of studies which have now been done to see, in particular, the impact of social media on adolescent mental health. So I've given you all the links to this, and we will discuss this issue of governments which are rushing to try and get more people online shortly. So let's move to the next slide. So we all know about this. I'm assuming other speakers have spoken to it. The relative power of nation states versus big tech. We have GAFAM in the West, and we have BATEX in Asia. One of my friends calls it, he says he calls them better as the BAT-G mafia together. And then we also have new technologies. For example, very powerful language models under artificial intelligence, such as the GPT-3, which everybody admits they don't really know how to control, and they don't fully understand the implications of these, what some people term foundation models. And these are very interesting for those of us who are already online, because we cannot actually tell how much of the content we consume has been created by another human being and how much has been created by GPT-2 or GPT-3, which I assure you I did not use in developing this talk. So let's go to the next slide. And now I think this addresses your issue, Alfredo. We are connecting the last billions. If we look at all of those issues which I mentioned, are we delivering them up for further exploitation? Because we know that over the past couple of years, there's been a massive acceleration in the number of people getting online. And I've given you one source here, Data Reportal, which says that in January 2022, we had about 62.5% of the world online. We don't know how many of those people had what is now called a meaningful connectivity, but almost certainly many of those people would have been using social media. And we know from the example of Myanmar, for example, that even a very light access to the internet can have huge ramifications, as we saw the use of Facebook Basics and the massacre of the Rohingya from fake news, etc., etc. So we have both direct and indirect impacts. We have new forms of exclusion. For example, many government services are now going online. Governments are rushing to digitalize. They want to show that they are part of the 21st century. And so many government services are going online, even where citizens may not be literate, may not have any experience of using computers, and may not be able to communicate effectively in the language of the platforms. And then we have a whole new set of issues. And let's not forget that going online can actually improve lives immensely. It has the potential to give you access to better health information. It has the potential to give you access to better education. But we also see that perhaps because of the pandemic, many governments rushed and they've been hiring out services to major platforms. So the influence of platforms is growing. And if you think of the social and cultural impact, when you see that the education system is taken over by just a few major platforms, you can assume that it will be more challenging to ensure the localization of content and the fact that people can now actually, how could we put it? That all the variations we see today, because people are creating content for their classrooms, could disappear if now this is handled at the level of platforms. So I don't know, Alfredo, whether that answers your question.
Yes.
For me, the fact is that, yes, we want to get more people online. We know that there are real advantages to getting people online. But then, what are we doing to make sure that they will come online safely? That's the big issue for me.
Yes. And I agree with you, Dorothy. Sorry to interrupt you, but you bring important facts to the table that everybody needs to be aware of. And it's interesting that you mentioned the e-government issue. And I can give you Puerto Rico as an example. After the hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, we didn't have internet. I mean, telecommunications were down all over the place, and even to reach government resources to help us out in it after the fact, it was so difficult. We didn't have the primary services, water, electricity. So I'm just wondering if we extrapolate this to the countries that don't have the meaningful connectivity, how do you foresee the governments reaching out to those communities? And I'm guessing that your answer is going to be that it has to be the companies, the private corporations, those that have the money to exploit, quote unquote, those that do not have access to reach out to them to get them to pay for that.
Yeah, I think, Alfredo, first of all, we have to recast the discussion. Okay, so we are always talking about connecting the next billion. We talk, when we talk about internet access, we talk in terms of infrastructure and making sure that people have a connection. But the real issue when it comes to the social and cultural impact is what is the kind of content that is going to be carried on that internet going into those communities? And what kind of skills have you given those communities to be able to cope and understand some of the issues that I have just mentioned in the previous slide? And the fact is, even in the most technologically advanced societies, there are very few people who actually understand the issues. And that's why we have a course like this, which is making people more aware of the implications. Big companies are interested in making money. That is why you have a company. It is not, in my view, their job to ensure that we have, let us put it very openly, as safe spaces. That comes through a dialogue with their potential clients and with the governments and with NGOs. And so we have to make sure that all of these parties have enough awareness of what the real issues are to have a real dialogue. And I think this is what we mean when we talk about a multi-stakeholder kind of engagement. But so far, we have, at the level of leadership, we have many people who still haven't grasped how different the internet we have today is from the internet we knew in 2003. And the huge implications when you have platforms where with the kind of turnover that would exceed the GDP of many, many states, even those which are highly industrialized. I remember reading something that said the GAFA together have more money at their disposal than Germany does in terms of its GDP. And we know that Germany is a major, major economic power. So there are many changes that have happened. We need people to become more aware. And I'm hoping that this will help. Are there any other people who want to jump in with questions? Did you understand my reference to the Rohingya?
Well, I didn't, Dorothy. So if you can elaborate a little bit more, I'll appreciate it.
Okay. One of the big platforms, I think it was Facebook, had a version of one of its services that was very light. It didn't require a lot of data. As you know, that people who are relatively, who have smaller incomes, less disposable income, very often cannot afford a full internet experience because of the cost of data. And so this particular solution allowed you to see headlines. And so from what I've read, because I wasn't there, but what I've read, people who were intent on creating violence would put up misleading headlines. Something like, go to Alfredo's house. They're busy killing off Glenn McKnights. And so they'll, all of Glenn's friends will rush to Alfredo's house, persuaded that he's doing something terrible to Glenn. And so the result is they do something terrible, and then you have a genuine headline. And so these are some of the things that actually companies have already worked on to try and improve. But it's a process we are learning. So do you get it now? And
yes,
if you Google Rohingya, you'll be able to see there's been a lot of ink dedicated to that topic. It's the same thing that happens in many jurisdictions where young people are persuaded to engage in violent extremism because of fake news and misinformation. So I think all of us are well aware of those things.
yes. Thank you, Bill. I see you have your mic open, so you have the floor.
Yeah, I was going to say that while we've seen that in less developed countries where there are sometimes official efforts to generate violence, as we saw with the Rohingya, for example. We also see it in other jurisdictions. In the United States, the improved ability to communicate specifically with people who ideologically agree with you has managed to outpace the ability of, or at least the implementation of, pardon me, of the ability of companies to keep fomenting of violence restrained.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting issue, perhaps not for this group of students, but I'll just mention it. Lots of discussion around echo chambers. But it seems that much of the power of persuasion to influence people to hold certain opinions is actually very sophisticated. It's more along the lines of the Cambridge Analytica type of situation where you profile people and you're able to understand which arguments would persuade them to shift their position. And then you actually target the people who are kind of middle of the road and undecided, And so there's some very interesting research that's been done on echo chambers and influence and how networks are built up that actually indicates the opposite. So I'll encourage you to look at that. I've been looking at it, but I'm not fully persuaded about the research. So anyway, let's move to the next slide. And so the focus really, when it comes to social and cultural, is for me about content. And it's very rare that in the discussions about connecting the next billion, that people talk about content, that there's an actual effort to understand where people get their information. And we know that from that same report I just cited, that globally, about 58% of all people are using social media. So how does that affect their mindset? How does that affect their link with their own community? That's what we were just discussing. And who curates that information? For example, I have not given you figures here, but I've been amazed when I've looked at the figures. I didn't give you the figures because the figures change daily, but you can check it out. And as I said, I was amazed by how many of the world's children are using Wikipedia to do their homework, and who wrote the Wikipedia articles. It's interesting. Wikipedia is very interesting because we have Wikipedia wars where one group of people will write their version of an event, and then the people on the other side of the event will quickly get back and edit the article and give their version of the event. And I heard a story which really touched me, that one of the leaders of the First Nations met with some technology gurus, and they were asking him what could they do for his community. And they thought, oh, they'll put in a few satellite dishes and, give them some computers and some training. And he said, please, could you correct the Wikipedia article about this battle with our people, because we see it as genocide and it's being written as if they were overcoming savages. And this is not the truth of that history. So who curates that information? And we are all so dependent on Google. And I deliberately tried to keep the links which I put in this talk. I've deliberately tried to keep them. I think maybe in a couple of cases, I went to the second page, but almost all the links that I've used come up on the first page of a search. And that gets you to think, how do you get on the first page of a search? And I think we all know that you can pay for that. And so as a result, what kind of content are we being exposed to? At one level, you could say that for many of the people, even those who are online in many countries, once they don't speak and read the language that is that the content is available on the internet, they may not be directly affected by this. But we do know that there's an amplification of content from online that goes into other forms of media. And I put Funredes there because they are one of the few groups that is actually doing work on language online. Of course, they focus only on the major languages. They are not, I haven't seen them documenting how much happens in my language, Akan, but you can find English, Chinese, etc., etc. And what's very interesting is they're saying that the influence of English is decreasing at one level. And you see other languages coming up. But the most interesting fact is that it's a multilingual environment online. And then who is creating that content? As that leader of the First Nations pointed out, he did not recognize what happened in the write-up of that event concerning his people, and how much reflects their culture or our culture. How much of what we read is subliminally giving us another worldview, another way of analyzing the world, because we are not contributing that content. Let me stop now and ask if we have any questions about content.
Well, Dorothy, this is Alfredo. I'm just wondering, how much influence do famous people have on the credibility of that of a content, especially if the famous person is actually from that country, and the type of information he or she is giving is false. And we can talk about fake news with the past president of the United States. And at the same time, Glenn writes in the chat that teaching critical skills is very important. But to mind comes, how can you teach critical skills if you're not even able to connect to the internet and you come from an underserved country? So those are questions for you, and see what you can say.
Yeah, well, you know, I have, as one of my earlier degrees, a degree in philosophy. And in philosophy, we have a number of standard fallacies. And one of them is the ad hominem fallacy, that because somebody is good at something, that you can respect their viewpoint on everything. And you know that is not the case. If somebody is a movie star, they may not know much about COVID. If somebody is a president, they may not have background in science. So these are skills that I think we can teach. And perhaps if we go to the next slide, but I think that what I'm trying to show here is that we have an opportunity. If we become more aware of the realities of our information ecosystem, if we understand our information ecosystem, that it's influenced by big business, that it's influenced by who is making the effort to create. And I really like the Wikipedia people, because when they did the analysis and they found out that most of their content was being created by white males based in a certain jurisdiction, they've really made an effort to try and get more women contributing content and more people from different jurisdictions contributing content. But the problem we have, one of the problems we have at the moment, is that most people, when they do a search on Google, they absolutely do not think about, why is this coming up first? You know, and I used to, when I had the pleasure of teaching people face to face, I'll just let them Google something. You know, we used to Google, let's say, women in Puerto Rico. And then we Google women in the US. And Alfredo, I'm giving that to you so that you do that. And you see what difference comes up, you know, the difference in the images that come up. Normally you see in the US, they give you a few judges and, you know, that kind of thing. And then for other jurisdictions, you see some dancers and that kind of thing. So who is responsible for that? And if we're getting new people to come online, should we be focusing first on the access, or is there education that can be done offline to prepare them for that? And there are multiple channels of media, and everybody knows that for many of the communities that will be coming online in the near future, they're very dependent on radio as well as television for content at the moment, less so in terms of print media. So it means there's opportunities to do campaigns using those channels to make them aware of the new environment that they will be entering. Is it worth it? Does it make a difference for a government? to invest in that. Glenn was saying the big companies should invest. I think it's good if we can persuade them to make a contribution, but I do believe that governments have a responsibility. Civil society has a responsibility because they're already engaged with those communities in so many other different ways. Any comments?
Bill?
It seems to me we know that people will tend to listen to, for lack of a better term, famous people. And I think it might be interesting to look at, how does someone become famous? We can, in some cases, it's fairly obvious, movie stars, sports stars, but there are people who are, I guess the term we use here is pundits, who are famous for their opinions without any, the question is, how do they become famous for their opinions? Is it because their opinions are resonate with people, or is it because they happen to have a particularly good platform to speak from? I think there's an issue there that could stand a little bit more exploration. Thank you.
Definitely, I have to agree with you that it needs more exploration. And this is the other problem that we need to address, that we don't have enough research and analysis going on when it comes to our information ecosystems. And what research does happen often stays within academia, whereas we need to get it out to the people. We need action research that can help people to navigate these things better. I'm just imagining, let's say somebody lives on an island of Africa that has not yet got high-speed broadband. Maybe there are about 8,000 people living there, and they have a traditional lifestyle. What happens when you give them high-speed broadband? What kind of content would they be checking out? If we look at the patterns of internet use, we can see that much of the content that they'll be looking at is mildly illegal. That's the most viewed content globally. What could we have done to prepare them better for that? And one of the things that we can do, apart from explaining to them better how the whole new system works, is encouraging them to create content. We have a whole app economy. I found it very fascinating because I judge competitions with apps, and we see people retrofitting apps, maybe not so much now, but before, I'll see somebody looking at an app in the US and then creating the same app to be used in Africa and designing it for an iPhone. And meanwhile, there are very few iPhones in the system in Africa. So if you were developing for the African market, you probably need to also have a version on Android. So just tells you that adapting an application so that it's actually useful for a particular environment. We're talking, when we look at AI, we're encouraging diversity in the teams that come up with the AI applications. So let's look at that little island of Africa, which hasn't been hit by broadband yet. And what kind of apps would we be developing? Who would be developing them? How do we prepare them to create content? So maybe we can move to the next slide. And I think I've said it already, as we prepare for the next billions to come online, why not just focus on the technical infrastructure? I think everything I've said before when it comes to the social and cultural impact of the internet tells us that we cannot just look at it in terms of a technical infrastructure. We have to look at the content dimension. And we definitely need to improve our efforts when it comes to media and information literacy. I have put that standard, which has been developed by IEEE with the DQ Institute in terms of global standards there. But I've been fascinated as I work on this topic to find that even in the most mature economies, when it comes to technology, there's very little cohesion and consistency when it comes to educating their population on the nature of the new information ecosystems that they're dealing with on a daily basis. And I can't overemphasize how important it is that we look at that issue very carefully for the next billions that come online, because we are seeing that our societies are not, you know, there's so many positive, look at how fast we were able to develop a COVID vaccine. This is only possible because we were using artificial intelligence. We're able to communicate rapidly with people from all over the world. There's so many positive dimensions of our online lives that we haven't been looking in depth at some of the less positive implications for our societies. And we must do that. And we must educate people so they understand that and they're able to navigate their way through. So we definitely need to improve our research on impact. And I think in closing, because we're near the top of the hour, so we can go to the last slide, I want to just emphasize the fact that there are such great opportunities for us to work together on this set of issues. There's a way in which we can license the knowledge we produce in such a way that it can be freely shared, for example, using Creative Commons licensing. And then we have that whole movement on digital public goods that is emphasizing the importance of making software, data sets, AI models, standards, and cultural works so that we work together to address some of these issues. So thank you all. And if there are any questions, I'll take them now. I'm not sure we have any students online, do we?
No, Dorothy, sorry for that. Siva was online, but he had some issues connecting. But I know that everybody will watch this recording because it's a very interesting topic from the social and cultural perspective, especially when you point out that there's some issues that we're not considering when we're trying to get the next billion people online, like linguistic issues, the content that is shared, how it is being shared, and how do people connect to the internet and what type of information they're looking for. So those are very important issues.
Alfredo, the other thing which is really important is how do we give them the skills so that they can create their own content? You know, the internet could be a way in which they actually preserve their cultures by documenting their culture and making it available online. But if they don't have the skills to do that, that could be an issue. So I think the dimension of content creation is very, very important.
Yes, I agree with you, especially in their native language, which is a project that Bill is working on. Bill, you have the floor.
Yeah, we've been working on basically how to put domain names into various people's native languages, so that they can at least look at a website's name and understand what it is that's supposed to be. The problem I have observed is that I've been working in particular on the Latin script. And the problem I've observed is there are several hundred languages which use the Latin script. And we've been attempting to not only determine what letter plus diacritic mark combinations are used, but which ones are readily confused. And the problem is most of those languages are in Africa. And the people we have involved in the group, we do have one person from Egypt, if you want to count that as Africa. But the rest of the group, we have two people from the United States, two from Germany, one from Sweden, and one from Serbia, which probably means that our grasp of what will be confusing to someone who speaks one of the languages from Ghana or Nigeria, etc., our understanding of what they will find confusing is probably imperfect, to be polite. So I think that actually extends to a lot of the discussion on, how do we get the next billion people connected? The people who are trying to figure that out have generally very little representation from those billion people.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because we were just debating this on the NCUC group about the new GTLDs, etc., and confusion between, say, Cyrillic even and the Western alphabet. But I was just talking to a gentleman in Mongolia who has put together a text-to-speech app for Mongolia, and who also did some work with Unicode. And so I think that what we are seeing is that there are a lot of people who are working on this within their national jurisdictions. And it would be interesting to do a call and see if you can rustle up some of those people to join you. I was fascinated with what the gentleman had done in Mongolia, a really interesting app, and we see that there's people are becoming more aware of the importance of those issues.
So thank you, Dorothy. Before we finish this session and I pass the mic to Glenn, I do want to announce to all the participants that next week's session with Walid Al-Sakid will be through Zoom. So you will need to register. So go to the module on emerging technologies, look for the big blue button announcement, and click on the link to register, and you will get your credentials so that you can log on to next week's session. As also most of you are aware, next week will be the last session, the last live session. And after that, you'll have 7 to 10 days to complete the course if you are interested in the certificate. Keep in mind that the certificate of completion will only be granted to those that, first of all, have acknowledged that they agree with the guidebook that we have at the beginning, those that have completed all the quizzes with at least 80% in each one of them, and that you do the final survey that we have after the emerging technologies module. You will automatically get your certificate. You will see it in the corresponding module, and you will also get it through your email. So be aware of that. If you have any issues, remember you can contact info@virtualsig.org with your questions. And Glenn, you have the floor. I don't see Glenn activating his mic. So if there are no other,
Yes.
Glenn, go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, I muted it during the session so I wouldn't make any noise. Okay, great session. And again, it's consistent to the philosophy that we have, that this is critical in terms, not just the boxes and the connection to people who are disconnected, but providing quality materials that they can actually change their lives and be enriched. So this, I think you touched on a number of very valuable concepts, Dorothy. So I'd like to just ask you if you have any final comments, and then we'll conclude the session.
Well, thank you. I did miss having students arguing with me. I deliberately made this presentation slightly provocative so that I could get pushback from people. But I think that the element that I would like to stress is that of giving people the skills to be able to understand the information ecosystem, not to take things for granted, and also giving them the skills and encouraging them to be able to create content that they are going to find relevant for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Glenn. And
thank you again
for the invitation, and Bill, and yep, that's all I see now. Yeah.
Great. Okay, that concludes our session today. The recording will be available for everyone